Some iOS users sued Apple. Apple might not just be a monopoly, but also a monopsony. Coined by British scholar Joan Robinson in 1933, a monopsony is defined as a market structure in which a single buyer substantially controls the market as the major purchaser of goods and services offered by would-be sellers. So how exactly does Apple fit under that definition?
I want y'all to picture something real quick. Imagine Apple's ecosystem like one mall, where Apple decides which apps can open, what they're allowed to sell, and how much they get to keep inside that space. Now tell me that ain't a different kind of power.
3 words: the App Store. Unlike the Mac, where you can download a music app like Spotify directly from Spotify's website, on an iPhone or iPad, you can only download the Spotify app through the App Store. And this is where the trouble begins for Apple, because they control the only legitimate way to get apps onto iPhones and iPads.
I know I'm not the only one just realizing this, but on a Mac, you could download straight from a company's website without thinking twice. On an iPhone and iPad though, everyone has to go through one gate first. And I've always wondered why that is. If you're watching this thinking they could have made both systems the same, they absolutely could have. The software on iPhones and iPads was built from day one to run through one official gateway, while Mac software was built to allow broader installation. And that difference is where this starts.
You can make a pretty easy argument that they have complete market dominance over the would-be sellers, who in this scenario are the app developers for iOS and iPadOS. Apple can set whatever terms they want for apps sold through their App Store, and over the years they've done just that. Now some of you at this point may be thinking, so what? But would you have that same opinion if you knew that you were being charged more for simply purchasing things with an iPhone?
Let me put y'all on game real quick. When Apple raises the cost of selling on their platform, these companies not about to eat that hit out of kindness. They bump their prices to stay whole. And when that bill shows up, that difference lands on you. Yeah, you.
Some iOS users sued Apple in 2013, claiming the 30% App Store fee at the time Apple charged all app developers was being passed on to them as iPhone consumers. The court ruled that iPhone users could not sue Apple. This case was appealed all the way up to the US Supreme Court, where Apple actually lost.
Now I know some of y'all watching this thinking, okay, that's just how their system works. But every system got a point where people stop saying that's the rules and start asking if the rules are fair. And historically, that's when markets shift. The moment participants begin questioning the structure itself, the conversation moves beyond business and into something much bigger.
In 2019, the Supreme Court upheld a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision which stated iPhone users who purchased apps, in fact, do directly purchase them from Apple. Therefore, the antitrust cases brought against Apple by iPhone users could continue.
Don't even front. When you looking at me right now, you was not surprised by that, cause I ain't either. Apple, y'all tripping though. You control the space, so you can't act like you ain't responsible for what happens inside of it.
Here's where it gets even worse for Apple. Justice Kavanaugh, writing for the majority in this case, wrote that Apple could not only be sued by its customers over a monopoly theory, they could also be sued by app developers on, you guessed it, a monopsony theory. That part of the ruling would come to haunt Apple just 1 year later, when in 2020, Epic Games, the maker of Fortnite, sued Apple.
See, this is the part that got me thinking, if the rules get that tight, why don't companies just stop playing in that space altogether? I mean, seriously, why stay in a system where somebody else sets every term? If you're an app developer, and you know putting your app on one platform could put it in front of hundreds of millions of people, while anywhere else might reach a fraction of that. Which door you walking through? Cause I know my answer.
And they didn't just sue Apple, they went thermonuclear war on Apple. Epic Games kicked off their lawsuit first by purposefully pushing a Fortnite app update which switched on Epic Games' own payment processor, breaking Apple's App Store policies, which caused Apple to kick Fortnite off of the App Store, which Epic was waiting for.
At first glance, it sounds simple. Apple owns the store, so of course they can remove an app. But Epic's whole argument was that when one store becomes the only real way to reach iPhone users, that kind of control stops being just a store rule and starts affecting the entire market around it.
As soon as that happened, they filed their lawsuit and released a video on YouTube titled 1980 Fortnite, a shot-for-shot remake of Apple's own famous 1984 Super Bowl ad. Only in the Epic Games version, Epic is disrupting Apple's iron grip on the app distribution for iOS and iPadOS. Apple technically won the first round, though this case was appealed and is working its way up through the court system and will likely be appealed all the way up to the US Supreme Court.
Man, that's cold though. Imagine remaking Apple's own legendary ad just to flip the message on them. That's basically Epic saying, look at the machine y'all built. Now watch what it does to the companies inside it. And that's why that video mattered. Epic wasn't just arguing in court. They were trying to show the public what dealing with a platform that powerful looks like from the app developer side.
Spotify's another one. Spotify has two main complaints against Apple. The first involves the apparent conflict of interest Apple has by controlling iOS and iPadOS distribution, while at the same time competing directly against Spotify with Apple Music. For Spotify to sell its music subscriptions through its iOS and iPadOS apps, it must give Apple a 30% cut, or tax as Spotify likes to call it, allowing Apple to undercut Spotify's subscription pricing.
Nah, that's brutal though. If you gotta pay a platform a cut just to sell there, your prices gotta go up just to stay afloat. Meanwhile, the platform's own product don't have that problem. And you already know customers usually gonna pick the cheaper option.
Plus, Apple's App Store rules prevent Spotify from letting their customers know they could make a purchase outside of its app, when Spotify wanted to sell audiobooks through its app. In order to avoid Apple's App Store fee, the Spotify team developed a 9-step process for buying an audiobook.
Yo, who in here agrees with me? First there's a cut just to sell in the store, then you can't even tell your own customers there's another place to buy it. What message is Apple sending to anyone trying to compete with them? From a business standpoint, the logic isn't complicated. If you built the platform where the transaction happens, you'd want your cut of that transaction too. Letting companies send customers somewhere else would mean giving that up.
Aside from the completely horrendous user experience, Apple did approve the app update submitted by Spotify with this new feature. But just a few days later, Spotify submitted another app update completely unconnected to this new audiobook feature, and Apple rejected it. The Spotify app was rejected for not following the guidelines regarding including explicit in-app communications to direct users outside the app to make digital purchases.
Imagine living in someone's house where they got a list of rules about what you can and can't do. After a while, you start wondering if it's even worth staying there. And for a lot of companies trying to operate inside the App Store, that's kind of what it feels like.
Now, when you try to purchase an audiobook in Spotify's iOS and iPadOS apps, you're presented with a message, want to listen? You can't buy audiobooks in the app. It's similar to the one you see in the Netflix app or when you try to buy a Kindle book on the Amazon app.
Now, some of y'all probably noticed when you open certain apps today, a lot of companies don't even try to sell inside the App Store anymore. They'd rather send people somewhere else and keep control of the purchase. Hey, let the truth be told. If sending people somewhere else means your customers don't end up paying more than they have to, why wouldn't a company do that?
If consumers don't like Apple's practices, they can get Android devices, and Google has the leading smartphone OS market share worldwide. Apple also argues its total control over the App Store is essential to its brand proposition for iPhones and iPads. Consumers want to be able to download software from any developer in a marketplace that's safe, trusted, and protects user privacy.
Take a step back for a moment. When one company controls the gate to an entire marketplace, the real question isn't just how the rules work, it's how much power that gatekeeper should have in the first place.
The question is if Apple has total control over the software distribution for the iPhone and iPad markets, and it's pretty difficult to argue they don't. That's why Apple is getting hit with lawsuits from both its users and app developers for its platforms, and why regulators are taking a hard look at the company.
There's also one thing you guys probably missed. Apple's whole ecosystem works the same way. Once you're inside it, everything is designed to connect with everything else. The iPhone, the MacBook, the iPad, the AirPods. And the moment you try mixing something outside of that system, the experience just isn't the same. Apple's real advantage is convenience. Their devices are designed to work so smoothly together that the more of them you own, the harder it feels to switch to anything outside their system.
U.S. lawmakers have drafted antitrust legislation targeting the company, and the U.S. Justice Department is reported to be in the early stages of filing an antitrust case against Apple. And in the EU, lawmakers have passed the Digital Markets Act, which, in order to comply with that law, Apple is reportedly readying major changes for iOS 17, including allowing users to install third-party app stores and sideloading apps onto iOS devices.
What's interesting is some of that pressure didn't just stay in courtrooms. Over the last few years, regulators pushed Apple to start loosening parts of that system, including allowing alternative app stores and more ways for developers to distribute their apps.
That would be a dramatic shift for the company, and this would have a huge impact on the ways people can use iPhones and iPads, and how developers could then design apps and generate revenue from them. So that's why you'll likely be hearing more about Apple and its potential monopoly and monopsony power, and the antitrust cases against the company.
Funny thing about technology, the companies that build the platform set the boundaries, and everyone else has to operate inside them. I agree, most people don't even notice it until somebody finally starts questioning it. But what y'all think?
Not just later this year, but likely in the many years to come.